The Big D, WDRC, remembers the way it used to be.
You know, Dave.
What?
Our next guest needs no introduction. In fact, every day,
But
around this time.
yeah, but it's it's getting to that time. What are you going to be eating today?
You know, I kind of think about it, and actually we should turn to a gourmet.
a
that
gourmet.
could really point this out.
A guy
And
who's an expert at it.
needs no introduction at all. Who's on the line with us today?
This is Bob Craig.
Well, Bob, nobody knows lunch like you know lunch. What are you having for lunch today, Bob?
Well, today I thought I would recommend to not only myself but to my gluttons and gourmets a crushed lima bean sandwich along with some mixed salsa along with a bit of sliced oranges with chocolate pudding on white bread because it's
Lunch time!
time.
And then they went directly into what they call the electric turkey, right? Right into the news. Bob, how the heck are you? What have you been up to?
Well, I've been up to no good as usual, but beside that, what is it that I can help you with, my children?
Well, why don't you take us back in the Wayback Machine and what it was like where you were before the Big D and what it was like to go into that building back then, because you were actually in the show place at 750. So tell us what it was like when you first started there at WDRC.
Well, I have to go back a few years before 1970. I began there in March of 1970. But my first introduction to WDRC was one winter's day, January 1965. And I was working at WARE in Ware, Massachusetts. And I did late afternoons and early evenings there. So one midday, I decided I would take a trip to Amherst. And I'm driving along in my 1957 Volkswagen on Route 9. And I'm flipping across the dial. And I ran across this radio station that sounded bigger than life. And I just couldn't place where it would be coming from. It didn't come in too clearly. But I'm listening. I'm hearing these wonderful jingles. Terrific guys on the air, production that was absolutely over the top. And I'm waiting, and where the hell is this station? I thought maybe Boston, New York. And I hear WDRC, the Big D in Hartford. And I said, oh, my God, this station is sensational. That is something I'd like to work at one of these days. So 5 years later, I decided to call Charlie. And I was working in Norwich, Connecticut at WICH from 1966 to 1970. And I set up an interview with your dad, with Charlie, and I drove over to 750 Main. And I went up, got out of the elevator, walked in, asked for Charlie, and they said, Charlie left. He's not here. I said, what? I said, I had an appointment, an audition. So I said, well, I'm sorry, he's not here. So I sadly drove back to Norwich, called Charlie the next day. Chaz, what happened? He was so apologetic, he totally forgot. He said, can you make it up in a couple of days or a week or whatever? And I said, yeah, let me drive up. So I did. I did the audition. I was highly impressed with the facilities, with Charlie, gave the audition. Charlie and I spoke for a while in the office, and he asked me if I would be interested in doing middays on the FM, which at that time consisted of slightly short of simulcasting, because we played the same music that you played on the AM. The only thing is that primarily all the music that you were playing on the AM had to be played from albums, because at that time, 45 singles, there were very few companies that gave one side stereo and the other side mono. So FM being in stereo, we had to do the album cut. And it was a 6-hour shift with no engineer, and you were really kind of working your tail off. Plus, you had to hit the top of the hour news, so if you were playing a vocal in the middle of it, you just have to fade out of it and respect the fact that there was a newscast to be heard. So that was really the beginning, and about a month later, Charlie asked me if I would like to do middays, a 5-hour air shift from 10 to 3 on AM. I immediately jumped at that, and that is where I sat from March of 1970 to October of 1974.
Wow, that's now when you first went in there, were you given the freedom to kind of develop your own style, or I mean, you know, you obviously very unique style that you've always had. What was it that? How much direction were you getting from Charlie back then?
Very little. Charlie had the great philosophy, as a lot of great program directors did at that time, of I'm hiring you, I know what you can do, now just get in there and do it. If I didn't know what you could do, I wouldn't be hiring you. So there was very, very little pressure in performance, and it was relatively simple. Once you got to the AM, it was, quite luxurious because you had a tech that did all the stuff except play the records, and you had the mic switch, and that was it. That was very, very comfortable setting, but you had to be thinking all the time of how you were going to come up with something a little bit different between these 3.5-minute records.
Bob was the first jock I worked with when I was at DRC. I was hired as his engineer, and our producer, as Dick Robinson would call it. And you were the first guy I worked with at DRC. And
he still has the scars to show it.
yes, you got to write it. Yeah.
Do you remember, Bob? Who was your predecessor? Do you remember who you took over for at that point in time? Who was sitting in the chair before you?
On the FM, I don't know.
But on the AM?
On the AM, I believe Joe Hager was doing the midday, and your dad wanted to put him into evenings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so he flipped in the evenings. You went in there. All right.
Right.
Now back then also, were you doing many contests, or what did your show consist of? They used to call that, back in the day, they called that housewife time or whatever, that midday slot. So what kind of was the music different than it would be, or how did that all work out back then?
It was slightly different, especially with the oldies that were played. I would shy away from the heavier rock oldies and kind of balance it out with, like I said, back in that day, it was known as the housewife time. Mm-hmm. So we thought it would be rather subtle because most of that listening was done at home for, again, quote, housewives. Mm-hmm. And we thought the music would have more of a romantic feel to it, more of a love feel to it. As far as contesting goes, your dad was the king of contests, so there was always something that was rotating as far as a contest or a promotion goes. Plus, I would inject some trivia questions that mostly dealt with music. So there was a balance of promotion, of contesting, to make the 5 hours that I was doing on the air a little bit more interesting and entertaining.
Bob, this is Dave here. How did you come up with the lunchtime routine? How did that? Actually,
it was something that I took with me from Norwich. I don't know, just one day, how you do things on the spur of the moment, and I did middays at WICH, and it just evolved. One day I said, well, why don't we just do something kind of different at noontime and recommend the lunch and make it as nauseating as possible.
Very well.
As long as I'm doing it in Hartford, we'll try it out in Hartford. And I became best known for that.
Yeah.
And again, the greatest things in radio always happen with spontaneity as opposed to being planned. And plus, I would get feedback from moms who would say, that's the only way we can get our kids to eat lunch is if they hear this man on the radio recommending and hearing the lunchtime feature that I did.
So would the mothers threaten their children, I'll give you what Bob Craig is eating if you don't eat this lunch?
No, I think the moms were more threatened by their kids than they were of me.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think all of us who had listened to you back then always knew if you had a fairly, somewhat together life. Like I know I was in high school. It was the early 70s, and it was usually, it was like, because we were on double shifts, we'd go in at night. It's when we would, not night, but early afternoon, up until the evening was our time for class. So I'd always be exactly getting into the shower because I was supposed to be at school about 12:15. So I'd be running through the shower, and as soon as I heard that, I'm like, whoa, but always the grossest. Were these things that you made up on the spot, or did you write them beforehand so you didn't duplicate yourself, or is that a secret that you want to share with us?
Oh, no, it was all spontaneity, just like I did with you right now. I don't know what the hell, I was going to come up with next. Sometimes it would be a half a minute to do it, and you just put together, or every so often you'd run across something that was really quite gross, and figure, well, let me write this down. Let me put this into the mix.
Well, and now, Dave, because you were working on the other side of glass, why don't you give our viewers an idea of what your job was and what was he like to work at? I mean, was he animated? Did he throw you cues when it was time to play, or what was it like to work with Bob?
Bob, can I tell him the real way, or should I just make a note?
I'll leave that totally optional with you, because we're about 250 miles away from each other.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Working with Bob was good because the engineer, a lot of times, I know when Dick McDonough was on the air, I would play to Dick, and I would do that with Bob, So I'm his audience.
Got to be.
But he was good to work with. Remember the time we did the remote, and when we did a remote with Mobile Studio D.
It was all glass. Yep.
Yeah, and we did. We had a two-way communications, and then we would push a button that would hit a tone that would allow me to fire the commercials back in the studio in Hartford. And one day we lost that entire line of communication back and forth, and we were. I got word to you somehow and said, just tell me what you're going to do next. And you picked it up right away. He said, and we'll be back after we hear from Wrigley Gum, Ford Chevrolet.
You're grabbing what he's telling you.
What he's telling me. And right after this, boom, you went right to it. And I think Charlie called him. He says, why are you giving the names of the commercials? I says, because we don't have any communications back to the Mobile Studio D. And Wayne Mulligan was running around like crazy trying to get that fixed, and he did. It took about an hour to get it done.
One of the things about working with a tech, and they come in various ways to do it. Some stations, the tech does everything. Some of the stations had the tech doing what we did at the DRC. Some stations had, God, I remember when I was working at WBZ in Boston as a studio engineer, all we had was the mic switch and ran tapes, and the jock played the records. But working with the engineer was something that was hit or miss. If you had especially young guys who were radio freaks, it was a pleasure because they would really be into your program and what you do, and you as a performer, as a DJ, would rely a lot of times on the engineer to react to what you were doing. Plus, Dave had this innate sense about throwing in wild tracks occasionally, like Sandy Beach's Laugh.
Oh,
which
my God.
really just adds so much, to do what you're doing and helps the spontaneity of it all. So I'd always welcome stuff like that. The crazier, the better.
Yeah, I know when we worked in the production room, I always tried to crack you up, and you have like a 30-minute, 60-second commercial should be in and out in a minute. It would be in there in an hour and a half until
it was so easy to crack me up anyhow. So
yeah,
that was very easy to do. All you had to do was look at me sometimes.
Now, so maybe Bob, what would be an example of maybe when you're live on the air, and is there something that ever put you over the top and you had a hard time getting back to putting it right on focus again? Did you ever lose your focus, or something just hit you funny in the copy or anything like that?
That would happen occasionally, but it was mostly, strangely, what would happen with me at DRC was, I don't know if you remember or not, but when the newscasts were done at DRC, the studio is shaped like a D.
Yep.
And for the DJ, facing directly into the control room with the engineer. Off to the left would be the newsman. Well, Lon Landis, for some reason or another, always cracked me up, just simply because he was so animated in a lot of the stories that he did. And a lot of times I'd have to read a 30-second spot in his newscast, and he'd be doing like a lifestyle story on the Hartford's Chicken Man, or he would be doing a story on something that fringed on X-rated, and it would just crack me up because not only was I able to hear what he was doing, but to watch his expressions as he was doing it. And then I'd have to read the spot, and sometimes I would just go. I mean, it was funny, but Lon had incredible self-control.
Oh, unbelievable.
Oh, but
I remember we had an engineer, John Landry, and no relation to Ron Landry. John Landry was an engineer, and Bob gave him the nickname of Duke. Duke Landry.
Duke Landry.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about Kojak, I think, or something. Had the hat, and John just came I was running the board. John just walked into the room. We were switching positions, and you just looked at him, and John just had that unexpected look that you didn't expect, and you lost it. I remember, and you had a tough time getting out of that. And he goes,
and John could have very serious expressions on his face.
Amazing. And we sit there, and I go, John goes, why is he laughing? I said, I think he's laughing at you. He goes, why? What's wrong with me? And it just went on from there. But,
now, I think you may have had Kevin Morris with you back then too, didn't you?
The cooker, yeah, Kevin Morris. Kevin was a treat and a half. God, I never saw somebody who was so engaged in a very animated way in engineering for you. He was a treat. All the guys that we worked with there were just really a joy to work with. I really enjoyed that feature.
Yeah.
I remember. I think you gave him the name the cooker.
I did.
You see, Bob had this way of kind of like coming up with all these different names. A lot of times, you guys would have your names adjusted or changed or whatever for the air, but everybody had their nickname. And so to this day, I mean, I just, the cooker, I always remember that. And of course, the Prince, Dick McDonough. Was
Paragon of Virtue, Bob Craig.
The Paragon of Virtue.
Does anybody ever ask where the Prince came from? Were you too?
No, yeah, it was me, and I have no idea how that came. I don't know.
So Bob, even if my dad would change it to somebody's name on the air, he would double change it over there. And I think that was a big thing too, Bob. Like you mentioned, how important the producer would be to you, your engineer back then, because I always say that if the person on the air isn't exactly with you moment to moment, it can really throw you off, because that is your connection a lot of times to the audience. And if somebody's looking away or talking to someone, that can just blow your whole psyche. So you did.
Yeah, it really is. I remember working part-time at WHDH in Boston back around 1976 when I was out on the Big D. So I guess it was late 75, early 76. And at WHDH, it was one of those stations where the engineer did everything, flipping you the mic switch, running the music, commercials, everything. You just stood there. And the engineers, they had mostly young engineers that were working. And those guys were directed by not only programming, but by the management. Once the microphone goes on, you guys have got to look directly at the announcer and never take your eyes off him. I want you to have total 100% contact with watching them and not missing their cue. They were very, very direct about that. I remember that distinctly. And actually, one day, Francois, who came from DRC to HDH, was my engineer.
Yeah,
he was. I remember how Francois liked to go skiing, and he was like probably all of 5 feet tall, and he wore, I think, a raccoon coat while he was
French
skiing.
beret. You wore a French beret.
Francois was a real character, and one night I was doing the all-night show at HDH, and it was the night where we had to set the clocks back, and I happened to look up. I was reading a newscast. We had no newsman overnight, so you just kind of read like 2 or 3 minutes of headlines. And I looked up, and there was Francois climbing on the console, rolling the clock back an hour. And I think I lost it then. Just simply because Francois, as you guys know, he was a character.
He was. Definitely was.
Now, what was it like to work? I'm thinking of some of these guys, and maybe you. What about Paul Rep? Do you remember Paul Rep?
Paul Rep, hey, Dick. I remember he would work with McDonough a lot. And he was, hey, Dick, what do you want to put in here next? Come on, I got 30 seconds. What kind of spot do you want to put in?
And I could picture him holding the newspaper in there, too.
Oh, yeah, reading the newspaper. My greatest memory of Paul Rep was on Sunday evenings. We used to run Casey Kasem's American Top 40.
Yeah.
And it was run out of the control room, which meant the engineer ran it because the jock was not there. So Paul was in charge of running the discs. We ran it off of discs. And as you know, the American Top 40 countdown would break every, 15 minutes or so. And Casey, would say, and now when we return, we'll hit number 31 this week on the American Top 40 countdown. And then you'd hear the jingle, American Top 40, Casey, coast to coast, and you'd come in and do a spot. The engineer would run the spot. Well, more than once, when running the American Top 40 countdown show, you'd hear, and now when we return, we'll have number 31 on this week's American Top 40 countdown. And then when it would return, number 13 this week, as we continue on with American, Paul would run the wrong disc, wrong side.
Oh, my God.
Well, I ran the first Casey Kasem show out of Hartford Sunday night, and they used to come to us on big 10-inch reels.
Oh, yeah.
We had 3 of them,
Yep.
and each reel was an hour long, so it was 3 hours long for the whole show. And one night we were playing this song, and they were playing Rod Stewart, You Wear It Well. And right there in the song, there's a pause. And right where the song, it paused, and it never came back. And I'm sitting there looking, quickly go to commercials and jingles, and it was nuts. I called Charlie up, and Charlie jokingly says, well, do your best, Casey Kasem.
Yeah.
I went into the FM studio, and I said, and now at number 14, here is he.
And he still has an old blooper reel that I think he has a clean version and then the version that really happened.
And it was, and I'm sweating. And then one time, same thing, except they gave me reel 2 twice. They didn't have a reel 3. So, but they would give us a list of the songs. So Charlie called, and he says, I called him about it, and he says, I'll be right there, do your Casey Kasem. And I did Casey, and then Charlie came in and ran the music and that. But I mean, it was, I'm the only one there. I'm the only one there.
Right.
I had that happen to me just recently with, because I'm doing, a talk format. And the young woman who was our producer just started there. And she just right out of college, really loved radio. And, couldn't wait, and she loved doing the Saturday morning show because it was always activity. We kept it light. We didn't do any political stuff, all kinds of guests. Well, one morning, my mic didn't go, and hers did. She goes, okay, Steve. And then all of a sudden, this young girl goes, well, I guess I've got to fill in for Steve. And she takes off, and I'm running out to the newsroom. Right, I can't hear anything because you always have to, no matter what, even if your meters aren't moving, you still have to, understand that you're on the air. Because you might be, but oh my God, no, that was wild. So all those years, Bob, what about when you got into a situation, like a serious situation, where maybe the news of the day would take over, or maybe there was a storm or something that really had to kind of maybe change your format because of the nature of what was happening? Because obviously from 70, 74, you had there was a lot of chaos, well, good chaos and bad chaos, I guess, during that period of time. So how did you have to adjust your program when something would hit the fan like that?
Well, I think that probably we would dispense with, any kind of fun activities that the station would be doing, and depending on the serious nature of whatever it was, you would respectfully maybe tone down the programming a bit. Nothing was as severe as the day that Kennedy got assassinated back in November of '63. And especially in Boston, where I was living at the time, Boston became, for lack of a better word, a morgue, and every radio station was playing either semi-classical music or beautiful stringy music, and that was about the most serious tone that I can ever remember, short of 9/11, that stations would take, because in the day of 9/11, stations immediately went to more instant news, and there was more, instant form of communication, as opposed to back in 1963, where you had to rely on news feeds, and, as everybody has seen, a video of Cronkite on the air when Kennedy got assassinated, how they were groping for news and getting information as quickly as they could. So things became a little bit easier in terms of getting spontaneous news on the air, either news feeds or direct contact, while the news was in the making, as they would say. I never really recall at the Big D having anything as serious as those two incidents, 9/11 or a Kennedy assassination.
Yeah. Now, what about, obviously your program would get, I remember getting interrupted with bulletins and stuff, with some big story would come out then and, interrupt your show, and then you'd have to kind of still go back into doing what you were doing before. I mean, that just had to be, because DRC, as I remember it, pretty much in many cases would be the leader in news in the market too. And when we spoke with Pat Sheehan, he said one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure, Bob, it was the same thing with you, trying to keep that news relevant to maybe teenagers and people that were into to DRC back then. Without that had to be a pretty difficult thing to do also. Just a whole different way. I remember when the station would have to we had a news
I think a
crew.
lot of stations changed. I know I was at ESPN then, and when 9/11 hit, I mean, we wound up taking over news for ABC, because ABC's tower was on top of one of the buildings, and we watch it come down, and they're feeding us stuff from New York, and then we're putting it out over our air, which was cable at the time, or satellite, and it was a zoo. But I have to say one thing, our entire crew did not want to leave their posts. They stuck by their posts, and they were intrigued of what was going on. And I mean, we had people peeling off labels on tapes just to be there if they were needed last minute, and a couple times they were.
It's interesting, and I want to get on to where Bob's career went when he left 74. But I just want to point out that putting this all together and the history of DRC and everything, I left with my dad in 1983. Bob had left in 1974. Yet Bob is the one that called me last year and said, "So Steve, what are we doing for the 100th?" And I'm going, we've both been out of there forever, but it's still and it's wonderful because, of course, in my heart, my mom and dad met there in World War II. I mean, it's in my blood, but I always love the fact that you guys still go back to what a great time that was to be on the air, to be at DRC, and all the fresh new ideas and everything. But then you decided that it was time for you to kind of contribute more and get more into programming. And how did that come about? How did you leave DRC in 74, and where did you go from there?
Well, I had a bit of a programming background when I was at WICH in Norwich, and I programmed as well as being on the air. And this is from 66 to 1970. So I always had a flair for programming, and I always especially loved working with the music. So after I was out of DRC in October of 74, the question mark is, now what do you want to do? So I wound up going over to WPOP in December of 74 and stayed there until June of 1975 when POP went all news. I was the last person to do a live program on WPOP. We ended up at 6 p.m. on a Sunday. That was followed by Wolfman Jack with his syndicated program. So 6 months at POP, again, I was out of a job. So I'm thinking now, gee, I love Hartford. I like New England. What am I going to do now? So I started to make the rounds, and I had known about WWYZ out of Waterbury, which was like the third beautiful music station in the Hartford market. And the station was going nowhere. It was ranked like maybe 16th out of 16 stations. So I went to Press Gilmore, who owned the station. Back in those days, you could actually do something like that, have a one-on-one with the ownership, especially if it was locally owned. So I gave Press an outline of my concept of doing a soft rock format. And he really didn't know what I was talking about because he wasn't into the music. He seemed somewhat interested, anything to get out of being 16th in the market. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, why don't you come back to me when the winter book comes out, the winter 1975 and 76 book comes out, and if the ratings are still sluggish like they are, let's talk more seriously about what you'd like to do. He said, in the meantime, I would like to have you, if you would, go down to WNAB in Bridgeport, he owned the AM station there, and kind of shape up the music to bring it up to a more contemporary but not a rock level, and do an air shift in the midday. I said, all right, I'll do that, and I did. And at the same time, I also got a part-time gig working at WHDH in Boston, which was a middle-of-the-road station, which is a station I grew up with. So I was back and forth on some weekends, driving from Hartford, where I still live, to Boston on the weekend, and then on the weekdays I would be driving down to Bridgeport, which was about an hour drive. And that lasted until the winter book came out in 1976. And I went back to Press and I said, okay, there was no movement of the ratings for YZ, and they had the owl as its symbol, as in wise. So I said, this is what we'd like to do. What I would like to do is to program a lot of these artists that I mentioned before, the Joni Mitchells, the Carly Simons, the Billy Joels, the Hall & Oates, the Moody Blues, and not only play some of the hits they were having, but also going into the secondary and tertiary tracks of the albums, because these albums were very, very popular, and come up with a concept that would have kind of a mellow, laid-back sound to it. So, again, he really didn't have much of an idea what I was talking about. He called his son in, who was Mark Gilmore, who was an engineer at the station, and he was of that age of the demo that we would like to reach. So Mark sat down with us, and he said, Dad, he said, I think this could possibly work. So he said, okay, what do you want to do next? I said, well, we're going to have to revamp the whole station, and we're going to have to order up all these albums and get the music aligned. He said, this is in May of 76. Let's get the music in order. I said, fine. What do you want to call the station? I said, I don't really know. I haven't given it much thought at this point. But we're going to get rid of the owl. We can't be WWYZ. Why don't we just call ourselves YZ, the Natural 92, because natural was a big word that was being used in marketing with food and granolas and all this shit. So I said, well, let's call it YZ, the Natural 92. We'll dump, the full 92 point whatever it was, and just call it, great alliteration here, Natural 92. Great, that'll work. This was done a few days before we would go on the air. And I, was really scrounging around because I didn't know all of this product. And we went on the air with something maybe about 300 or 400 tracks, and I had to get staff together. And Brian Thomas, who did news at DRC, was working at YZ. I said, Brian, would you like to stay and do the midday? Glenn Colligan was doing mornings. I needed voices on the air. And I hired Ted Sellers, who was doing some work, I guess, at what the hell was a station in Hartford that Savin owned?
CCC.
CCC.
Yep.
So I hired him to do afternoons. We had somebody doing evenings. I got somebody to do overnights. I just want these people to get on the air and make the back announce.
You started. You hired Joanne Nesty, didn't you?
Joanne Nesty was still in broadcasting school at Dick School.
I know.
And I really loved her sound, and I figured she's she's going to be great on the air. And I asked her, I said, would you like to be our news person in the morning? And she jumped at it because she was looking for a gig. She was out of the broadcasting school. And I liked her sound. Wait a minute, hold on. Let me just get a sip of water here.
Yep. Yeah, I remember because Joanne also did time at POP, time. But she also did a lot.
She did after she left YZ.
Yep.
And I knew she would fit in beautifully, and she sounded great. And she jumped at the chance to do it. So my staff was coming together. I'm adding more and more tracks. I'm getting more album product in. And in the meantime, within a week, back in those days, in the 70s, when you put an FM station on the air, you knew within a week or two whether or not the station was a winner. So within a week, we were getting phone calls, we were getting correspondence from people all over, because YZ had a hell of a signal. They, I think, had maybe the best signal of anybody who was on Meriden Mountain. So we were getting correspondence from Eastern Long Island, New Haven, Hartford, Meriden, Northampton, Massachusetts, Southern Vermont, and the station is really beginning to catch fire. And within a couple, 3 or 4 weeks, maybe a month, we had a call from CBS FM rep sales in New York City, wanting to get information about what the station was all about. And could we come up and talk with you guys, give the station a listen, talk with maybe having us rep you? So we said, sure, because they never had anything like this. So they came up. They wound up repping us. And again, the station is making huge inroads in the Hartford, New Haven market. The ratings are beginning to soar. And it was a big success. So 3 years into maybe a couple of years into the format, I get a call from TM Productions in Dallas, and they wanted to talk with me about not only programming the station that they had in Dallas, but also programming their syndicated soft rock format. So they flew me down, and I was very interested in talking with them, and they made me a job offer that weekend, and I really did not want to go to Dallas. This is as far south as I want to go in Philadelphia. So I went back to Press, and I said, Press, I have a job offer to go to TM Productions. And he said, what are they offering you? And I told him, and he said, I don't want you to leave here. He said, I'll match their offer. So he did, and I wound up staying another year. And then I got a call from WMGK here in Philly, and Julian Breen, who was head of programming, said, we have a job opening. Our programmer director, Dave Clare, is going to New York to program WYNY. And he said, I've been listening to YZ, and I like what you're doing, and I'd like to drive up and talk with you. So I said, great. So he came up, we had dinner, and he said, I'd like to have you come on down and talk with you and have you see what MGK is all about. I said, great. So the next weekend, I hopped a plane and was talking with them, the general manager, Larry Wexler, and Julian Breen, and we were talking about the format. And I spent a week in there. I came back to Hartford, and I said, Press, I have a job offer to go to Philly, and I said, I really would like to do a major market. He said, you're really kind of committed. And I said, yeah, I said, it's major market, it's Philly, and he said, there's no way I can counteroffer. I said, no. I said, I hate leaving. I said, but I think I've built the station to be on solid grounds with you. And keep in mind that Sharon and I had just started dating at this point. As a matter of fact, our first formal date was with Dick and Sally Robinson. This was in February of 1976. So I wound up accepting the job. We still had some kinks to work out, and they were very patient at Greater Media. And it took us 3 months to really iron out what they wanted me to do and what I would want to do. And I went to work with them in April of '79. So it was a great move. I never regretted a moment of it. It was working there was like Camelot. I mean, the station took off. We redirected some of the programming through the spring and the summer and the fall of that year, and wound up becoming really more of a contemporary, adult contemporary in January of 1980. And the station just zoomed. We wound up getting a 9 share in Philly. And to get a 9 share in Philly, you know, the Greater Media they were just over the moon about that. So everything just really worked out really well. And I spent like almost 10 years with WMGK and wound up spending about 25 years with Greater Media as a whole. So that is what happened to me programming soft rock radio.
Boy, I tell you, I mean, I can still remember how, you know, like that whole Natural 92.5, the Natural YZ, it was just also so different. And then, of course, a lot of other people started jumping on the bandwagon, and, you know, I mean, RCH at 100.5 started to do this, and then another, I think, ZMX, originally when they came in, they were softer too, and I was at Magic 104, which we lovingly called Tragic 104, but it was, nothing could compare. I mean, it was like, you know, you were like the original Coca-Cola in this Connecticut. I mean, everybody else seemed to be trying to copy what you were doing, and no one could come close. So here we are, all these years later, you've never really left the business, and so where has your life gone today, Bob? I mean, what are you up to?
Well, for the past 17 years, I've been working at WRTI, which is Temple University's jazz and classical station. And when I was out of Greater Media in 2004, again confronted with a situation about, now what am I going to do? I don't want to be retired because I still like radio. And I knew what they were doing at RTI. They were programming jazz and classical. And my wife had done some work over there amongst other things involving classical music, not only hosting, but also being involved with the Philadelphia Orchestra and also doing production work for WFMT out of Chicago, which was syndicating the Philadelphia Orchestra. So she had a number of things involving classical music, and I got to know the staff somewhat at RTI. And I was really interested in doing some jazz there, and they said, yeah, you want to do some fill-ins? That'll be fine. So I've been doing fill-ins there as well as weekend programming with singers doing jazz, and it's a very, very comfortable situation to be in because I can program my own music, and nobody bothers me, and it's music that I really like playing, and I'll do it as long as they want me, and so, you know, I've been at this for like 60 years, and that's all that I've ever done, and that's all I really want to do.
And how? Good
And
Lord's
you've
been
never
good to you.
never worked a day in your life, right?
I have never worked a day in my life, and don't intend to.
Yeah.
So radio, you know, radio is not obviously what it was back in the day of Big D, and even before that for me, and neither was it like that in the days of the soft rock. But it's ever evolved and it's ever changed, for the better or worse. You know, we'll just leave that as that, and I'm just very happy to say that it has been a terrific career for me, and I wouldn't change a minute of it.
Bob, I got a question. You named all the engineers at DRC, gave them nicknames. What was my nickname? I don't ever recall you giving me a nickname.
I know Schmuck came to mind.
Yes, you're right. What a schmuck.
Well, look, it looks like we're almost done with lunch.
Yes, we're almost done. Let's have supper.
Oh, my God.
It's been great talking with you and your career, and hope we'd have you back at some time in the future and give us an update. And love having you here.
It's always good to check in with another great Big D brother. Thanks a lot, Bob, and let's keep the lines open again, thank you so much for actually planting the seeds. And I think it's always going to hold a place in our heart. And it's nice that you still, you still remember.
Yes.
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, Big D, especially with Charlie at the helm, I mean, that place was just a phenomenal place to work at. And that was highly echoed at the reunion that we had, a couple of weeks ago. Everybody that was there just have great memories of that radio station. It was really, really something special. And Charlie, certainly, I think I had mentioned this before, Charlie certainly is one of the three most influential people in my career. And it was just such a joy not only working with him, but also to gain the experiences that I did from him.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what everybody seemed to say is what I really always enjoyed about him. But as his young son, it was always about, direction. And it was always about hiring guys like you and even like a Joey Reynolds. He knew what he was hiring when he would hire you. And
That's
I
right.
think he kind of directed you to go to your next step. And I always thought that was kind of neat. Instead of saying, this is how you should, this is the DRC way, he saw what you were when he hired you, which I thought was, and he always loved to see him fly. So here you are in Philly and everything else. And, he's just always smiled when he saw you guys fly higher and higher. So congratulations. I'm glad you're still in the biz. And I know we were talking about some things where the business may be going, and we could very well be traveling fast forward with Bob Craig.
And his outtakes.
All right, I look forward to it all. Thanks, guys.
Well,
Bob, I'll have to get you the outtakes I have of you.
oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. We won't be airing them here, though, but believe me, yep, he's not always as laid back. We had that one
That's
picture of him
true.
strangling you.
Accent on the word laid.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bob, and
All right.
we'll talk soon, man. God bless. Bye-bye.
All right, see ya.
Take care. Boy, what a great guy.
Oh, my
he's
God.
we had so much fun doing spots in the production room. And I remember Danny and the Juniors were appearing someplace, and we must have spent about an hour just trying to get this thing through. And then we did another furniture spot and talk about cannonball bed, and we both cracked up on that. And a great guy to work with. He was a real pro,
Yeah,
pro. all the
always,
way.
always up, always. And a lot of people don't really understand that. That these guys, people count on these guys to be carrying them through the day. So a lot of times, the real pros, whatever the format is, they all know that their job is taking care of that person, that housewife or whatever, whatever it is, just to keep them going sometimes during the day.
Yeah. Hey, thank you for joining us on WDRC Remembers, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, can we tell them about?
No,
Oh,
not now.
And he never lets me do
I
it.
don't. Nope, not now.
This is big.
No, I
This
know.
is big. I think he's going to be on parole, so it could be a good one.
Could be. So join us next time.
Thanks, everybody.